today we're going to talk about the difference between aerobic and anaerobic respiration. So far we've been learning anaerobic respiration, or respiration that occurs when oxygen is present. If you remember, and some of you probably don't, because you probably haven't looked at any of the respiration stuff since Friday, have fun. But oxygen is required in respiration because it's the final electron acceptor at the end of the electron transport chain. When NADH gives up its electrons to the electron transport chain, they need to go somewhere, and they end up being with oxygen. If there's no oxygen, the electron transport chain can't happen. Anaerobic respiration, you can see, let me get the pointer here, pointer options. Anaerobic respiration, ANA, is respiration that occurs without oxygen. And there are actually some organisms that only do anaerobic respiration, or respiration without oxygen. Today we're really going to focus on the difference of anaerobic respiration when we compare it to aerobic respiration. Okay, so like we said, cellular respiration requires O2. It's the final electron acceptor at the end of the electron transport chain, and it's required onto the part of the process where the H+ ions, remember those lovely H+ ions, it's required to do that process where the H+ ions flow through the ATP synthase and make energy. If there's no oxygen, the electron transport chain and chemoosmosis cannot occur. However, glycolysis, the first part, remember when we take glucose and split it into pyruvate, that can occur without oxygen. And that's how organisms who live in low oxygen environments produce most of their ATP, just with glycolysis. They don't do the Krebs cycle, and they don't do the electron transport chain. They get all their energy, which isn't a lot if you remember. It's only 2 ATP net, but that's how they get all of their energy. Now, for organisms that usually only do anaerobic respiration, glycolysis is coupled with an additional step in the process. And organisms that do respiration without or in absence of O2, that process is called fermentation. So fermentation and anaerobic respiration mean the same thing. There are two types of anaerobic respiration. We're going to talk about the two of them now. So at this point, you should have answered questions 1 and 2 on the guided questions. Now, question number 2, I'll just go over briefly. So the question number 2 asks, why does respiration stop after glycolysis when no oxygen is present? And the reason is that the electron transport chain needs oxygen to accept the electrons at the end of it. If there are no oxygens, the electron transport chain will stop. And if you remember, the whole point of the Krebs cycle was to make NADH and FADH2, and their job is to bring electrons to the electron transport chain. So there's really no point in doing the Krebs cycle if you don't have the oxygen to accept the electrons at the end of the electron transport chain. So fermentation, which is respiration without oxygen, or anaerobic respiration, consists of glycolysis, just like we learned, where we split glucose into pyruvate and generate 2 ATP, plus one additional step that regenerates NAD+. Okay? The reason why we need to do that is that if we kept on just making NADH, and there was no electron transport chain to take that electron, we would eventually run out of NAD+. So the final step in fermentation regenerates NAD+, so that glycolysis can continue. Otherwise, you would run out of NAD+, and glycolysis would stop, and then the organism would die. So there are two main types of fermentation. We have alcohol fermentation, which is done by yeast and bacteria. It makes alcohol. And then we have lactic acid fermentation, which is done by humans and animals. We do it when we're low on oxygen. We're going to discuss alcohol fermentation first, so this will be first, and then lactic acid fermentation second. So in alcohol fermentation, the first thing that happens is glycolysis. So it's sort of like, to take a step back here, we have glucose. So I'm just going to write glue because I don't have I'm writing with a mouse. And we take it to 2-pyruvate. That always happens. In every type of respiration that you do, you take glucose and turn it into 2-pyruvate. And I suck at writing, but that's alright. every form of respiration, whether it's with oxygen or without oxygen, you take glucose and turn it into 2-pyruvate. If there's no oxygen, then we're going to do fermentation as opposed to enter the Krebs cycle. Okay? So, we need to regenerate NAD+. Okay? So, after we get pyruvate, okay, pyruvate is converted to ethanol, and that's what makes you drunk in beer. Okay? And so we first do glycolysis, taking it to pyruvate. Then we have pyruvate. We take a CO2 molecule from the pyruvate, and then we actually take a hydrogen, and well, this is hard to explain, but so we have pyruvate, and what happens is we actually give a hydrogen to the pyruvate molecule from NADH, so we can regenerate NAD+. Again, why is this important? And we'll see in the picture on the next slide. Why is this important? If we didn't do this last step, we would run out of NAD+, and then glycolysis would stop, and then the organism would have no source of energy. Alcohol fermentation is used by yeast, and it's used by people who make beer. The ethanol is made in the process if you deprive it of oxygen. And it will produce, it's used in wine making or beer making. It's also used in baking because they release carbon dioxide, which makes bread rise. So this picture shows alcohol fermentation. So as always, we start with glucose and we do glycolysis. Okay. In glycolysis, we generate 2 ATP, and we get an NADH from the process. This produces pyruvate. Now, if this had oxygen, the pyruvate would now enter the Krebs cycle. But without oxygen, it doesn't. So what we do instead, because we need to regenerate this NAD+, so glycolysis can continue, okay, is we remove a carbon dioxide from the pyruvate. So this carbon dioxide, it's removed. Okay? And then we have something called acetaldehyde, which you don't need to know. Here's acetaldehyde. The carbon dioxide has been removed. And what actually happens is we take an H from the NADH and add it back to it. We add it back. And here's that sort of extra H that we have there, so that we can regenerate our NAD+. And then this process of glycolysis can happen again, and we can continuously generate 2 ATP from this process. Not as efficient as regular respiration, which makes 36 ATP, but sometimes enough energy for small organisms to live for a short period of time, or for bacteria to live forever. So now we have lactic acid fermentation, and lactic acid fermentation is done by humans and animals. Okay, it's very, very similar to alcohol fermentation, except we don't produce any alcohol. It'd be kind of funny if you could hold your breath and start doing fermentation and then produce alcohol and get drunk, but we don't do that. So lactic acid fermentation, it's the same process as alcohol fermentation, except you don't produce ethanol. You produce lactic acid instead. Lactic acid is an acid. It's kind of tart, so it's also used by some funguses and bacteria to make cheese and yogurt. It gives yogurt that tart taste to it. Human muscle cells, when they're low on O2, sometimes you'll develop cramps. When muscle cells are low on oxygen, they'll do lactic acid fermentation or anaerobic respiration. Those two mean the same thing. They generate some ATP, but not as much as they do in aerobic respiration. And lactic acid, when lactic acid builds up in muscles, it can cause cramps. So muscle cramps are caused by when there's low O2 in the muscle, and they do lactic acid fermentation instead of regular respiration. And this lactic acid builds up in the muscles, and that causes cramps. So this is lactic acid fermentation, or the picture for lactic acid fermentation. So once again, we always start with glucose. Okay, and we do glycolysis, producing our 2 ATP and our 2 NADH, and we get out pyruvate. That process is always the same. What's different here, though, compared to alcohol fermentation, is that we do not generate any CO2. Instead, NADH just gives its hydrogens back to pyruvate, okay, to regenerate NAD+. And that's the whole point of this process, is to get some energy still out and regenerate NAD+. And instead of producing ethanol, we produce lactate. And when lactate builds up in muscles, when they're low on O2, it causes cramps. So the main difference in lactic acid fermentation compared to alcohol fermentation is that we do not produce any carbon dioxide, and we also do not produce any ethanol. Instead, we produce lactate. You can sort of see the difference between the molecules here. So here, I mean, this has an extra H right here. Okay, and that extra H came from NAD+, which gave its H, or was oxidized and gave the electrons and hydrogen to lactate to regenerate back the NAD+, so that we can continuously do glycolysis. So if we compare fermentation, remember, without oxygen, this is without oxygen, so no O2, okay? And we're going to compare it to regular cellular respiration, okay? We're talking about the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis thrown in there because there's oxygen. Okay, we're going to compare them. Both processes use glycolysis to generate pyruvate. That happens in every type of respiration you can occur. But in anaerobic respiration, oxygen is not used. So that means we cannot have an electron transport chain because oxygen is the final electron acceptor at the end of that chain. Okay. Anaerobic respiration has an additional step to glycolysis in that it regenerates or takes this hydrogen and gives it to a molecule so that we can regenerate NAD+. Okay? If we did not regenerate NAD+, okay, we would run out of NAD+, okay? And then glycolysis would stop. And if glycolysis is stopped, then absolutely no energy is being produced, and the organism would die. Comparatively, anaerobic respiration produces much, much more ATP. Okay, anaerobic respiration without oxygen net produces 2. Aerobic respiration, so we have anaerobic fermentation, this guy, produces 2 ATP. Cellular respiration, however, produces 36, much more ATP. Much more ATP is generated during the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. And remember, without oxygen, we can't do that process. I hope I've said that enough. Without oxygen, the electron transport chain stops. So obligate anaerobes are types of organisms that only use fermentation. So they only do anaerobic respiration. And they actually die in the presence of oxygen. Okay. Some organisms are facultative, and I can never say that word correctly, facultative anaerobes, and that means they can either do fermentation or cellular respiration. Or they can do both. We are facultative anaerobes. We can do both. Although we cannot survive on anaerobic respiration that long. Eventually we would die. So technically we're not facultative anaerobes because we can only survive on anaerobic respiration for a short period of time. So we have obligate anaerobes, which they die in the presence of oxygen and only use fermentation, and facultative anaerobes, which can do either, depending upon if oxygen is present. If you're a facultative anaerobe, so here's glucose, okay, and we're going to turn it into pyruvate, as always as we always do in glycolysis. And now if you're facultative anaerobe, you have a choice. Okay? If there's oxygen present, okay, you're going to bring the pyruvate into the mitochondria, okay, where it's going to do the citric acid cycle and the electron transport chain and generate 36 ATP by chemiosmosis, our favorite term that is annoying for you people. If there's no O2 present, okay, it's going to do fermentation, which is where we regenerate NAD+ by producing either ethanol or lactic acid, depending upon which type of fermentation the organism is doing. So it's sort of like a fork in the road. One direction to go if there's oxygen. This way, actually. One direction to go if there's oxygen, and another direction to go if there's no oxygen. For some reason, the AP exam likes this idea. The fact that glycolysis occurs in nearly all organisms, and it's evolutionary conserved. Every single organism does glycolysis. It's thought that even the earliest organisms in the history of the Earth did glycolysis before there was actually any oxygen in the atmosphere, and that was their way of making energy. We'll discuss this a little more in class because the